Okay, so there's one military detail from our sources this week that really jumps right out. We're talking Russian fighter jets, MiG-31s, entering NATO airspace over the Baltic Sea. They were inside Estonian territory for, get this, 12 minutes, and their transponders switched off. Completely dark. Estonia, understandably, called it a dangerous escalation.
Hmm.
And NATO's response was pretty stark, basically warning they'd use all means necessary to defend their airspace. Welcome to Nation Scope Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan.
And I'm Jamie, our expert analyst.
We've really gone through a lot this week. Official reports, intel assessments, some deep analysis pieces trying to get a clear picture of Russia's war aims in Ukraine right now. Our whole mission here is to analyze the news that really matters, diving into these big events shaping, well, America and the world.
And this deep dive, it really uncovers this dual strategy coming out of Moscow. It's quite concerning. You see, on one hand, publicly, Russia is trying to project this image of being ready to negotiate, ready for peace talks. But then you look closely, really scrutinize the conditions they're actually putting forward privately. And it's nothing short of demanding Ukraine's total capitulation, the systemic dismantling of the country, really.
Absolutely. And at the same time, you've got Moscow actively poking, testing NATO's collective defense, Article 5. It's forcing some really tough choices in Western capitals. And then layering on top of all that, we absolutely have to unpack the, well, frankly, the whiplash-inducing U-turn in U.S. foreign policy talk regarding Kiev. So understanding how these three things, the negotiation facade, the military pressure, the Trump factor, how they all interact, that's where it gets really crucial. Let's start with that negotiation front. Because the gap between the public talk and the private demands, it's just staggering.
It really is. It feels like a very calculated exercise in, perception management. Foreign Minister Lavrov, he's quite skilled on the world stage, right? Expressing some hopes for dialogue, suggesting openness. But this message, this overture, it doesn't seem truly aimed at Kiev or even Washington directly. It feels targeted more towards the global south, towards non-aligned nations.
And why is that? What's the goal there?
Well, the goal seems to be painting Russia as the reasonable actor, the one actually seeking peace, and framing the U.S., the West, as, the stubborn ones, the intransigent bloc, needlessly making the conflict drag on.
Yeah.
They're really trying to wrestle control of that global narrative about who's responsible.
But okay, if you peel back that public layer, like you said, and look at the actual demands, the non-negotiables Moscow has put on the table just to stop fighting, it reads like terms of surrender. Our sources, including folks like the Institute for the Study of War, they flat out call these conditions for full Ukrainian capitulation.
Yeah.
Maybe we should walk through those four big demands. Because this really is the blueprint for what Russia considers total victory.
Exactly. Let's do that. The first one is maybe the most straightforward. Territorial capitulation. Russia demands international recognition of its control over all the territory it currently occupies. Okay, but here's the kicker, as you might say. Ukraine must also withdraw its forces from and permanently give up all parts of those four annexed provinces. Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia, even the areas Russia doesn't actually control militarily right now.
Wait, hang on, let's pause right there. They're demanding Ukraine hand over sovereign land that Ukrainian soldiers are actively defending, land Ukraine still holds. That's not a starting point for talks, is it? That sounds like a condition designed to make sure talks can't even start.
It certainly appears that way. It sets this expectation of, well, total victory before any peace process could realistically begin. Then the second category. This one, perhaps, cuts deepest into Ukraine's future ability to exist as a sovereign nation. Sovereignty restrictions. Ukraine must permanently, formally renounce any ambition to join NATO forever. It has to undergo what they call demilitarization. And it must be barred from ever hosting foreign troops or signing bilateral security deals.
Demilitarization.
Yeah,
That sounds vague. What does that actually mean in practice for a country that's just endured a massive invasion?
It means systematically stripping Ukraine of the ability to effectively defend itself down the road. It's not just about, say, shrinking the army size. It gets into severely limiting advanced weapons, missile defenses, any kind of long-range capability. You're essentially turning Ukraine from a nation capable of defending its borders into, well, maybe a heavily armed police state at best, but one unable to resist future pressure or attack.
Yeah.
It creates that disarmed buffer state Russia has long wanted. That's a core goal.
And critically, that makes any kind of post-war security guarantees from the West, from the US or UK or others, almost impossible to actually implement politically, logistically. It ensures Ukraine stays isolated militarily.
That's precisely the systemic objective. Okay, third category. This one moves into the political and cultural subjugation space. Moscow demands things like making Russian an official language, reinstating privileges for the Russian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, and, significantly, a wholesale rewriting of Ukrainian history books to fit the Russian narrative. Plus, that demand for denazification, which is widely seen as code for eradicating Ukrainian national identity elements that resist Russian influence, potentially banning political opposition wholesale.
Wow. So it really goes beyond military aims into trying to erase a culture. And the final demand, economic relief. That one sounds pretty blunt.
It is. The demand is for the complete, unconditional lifting of all international sanctions imposed on Russia since the war began.
Right. So when you put those four pillars together, it's just impossible to frame that as a genuine peace proposal. Like the Atlantic Council said, it's more like a blueprint for the end of Ukrainian statehood. Dismember it territorially, cripple it militarily, control it politically and culturally.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's clear that negotiation track is, well, mostly for show, for global messaging. So if they're aiming for total victory via this extreme terms, how are they backing this up militarily? This brings us to that calculated pressure campaign against NATO itself.
That's the other track running in parallel. Moscow is actively, deliberately testing the alliance's collective defense guarantee, Article 5. They're operating right in that gray zone, actions that are definitely provocative, maybe testing responses, but designed to be just below the threshold of overt attack. Plausible deniability, sort of.
Can you tell us more about the specific incidents? We mentioned the MiG-31 over Estonia.
Right, and that MiG incident was highly symbolic, flying dark, transponder off, deep into NATO airspace over the Baltic. That's designed to rattle nerves, test air defense, reaction times, soak doubt. But we've also seen very provocative drone activity over Poland, for instance, near the Ukrainian border. One report we looked at cited 19 Russian drones in a single incident near the border, forcing NATO jets to actually shoot several of them down.
And we've seen reports of single drone incursions over Romania, Latvia, too, right? So what's the overall goal here? Just intimidation?
Intimidation is definitely part of it, yes, but it's more strategic than just scaring people. They likely want to create friction, division within NATO about how to respond. They know the alliance dislikes escalation, and Estonia's defense minister pointed this out explicitly. These kinds of incursions force NATO countries to divert valuable resources, air defense assets, intelligence gathering away from supporting Ukraine. They have to pull them back to defend their own airspace. So it serves Russia's aims in Ukraine without needing to fire directly at a NATO target.
A resource drain tactic. Designed to weaken the support for Kyiv, create doubt. And this is all happening against a backdrop of really aggressive Russian rhetoric, right? Their so-called decisive response doctrine. Lavrov denies wanting to attack NATO, but in the same breath warns any aggression will be met decisively.
Yeah, and the crucial thing to grasp there is how broadly Russia seems to define aggression. This isn't just about deterring a future NATO attack on Russia. It's a form of preemptive deterrence aimed at shaping Western policy towards Ukraine. Putin and Lavrov have been explicit. Any foreign troops deployed in Ukraine, even a post-war peacekeeping force or trainers or security guarantors, would be considered legitimate military targets.
Before they're even there, before such a force is even formed.
Precisely. They're not waiting. They're trying to make the very idea of robust Western security guarantees for Ukraine politically toxic, legally risky, so risky that Western nations might just balk at providing them, leaving Ukraine permanently vulnerable and isolated. This is a direct challenge to the entire post-Cold War security setup in Europe. The goal isn't just about Ukraine anymore. It's about demonstrating that collective defense, that rules-based order, has failed.
Wow. So the low-level military prodding of NATO, the extreme demands on Ukraine, these preemptive threats, it all ties together. It's all aimed at achieving that systemic victory, overturning Europe's security structure, and ensuring Ukraine ends up as that weak, isolated buffer state.
It connects all the dots, yes.
Okay. Now let's throw a major curveball into this already complex picture, the Trump variable. We saw this really dramatic shift in rhetoric from the former president recently, and it has absolutely shaken up the calculations in Moscow and Kyiv, everywhere.
It was seismic, yeah. A complete reversal. Before, you remember, Trump had hinted at things like land swapping deals, vague comments that caused a lot of anxiety in Kyiv. But then, after meeting with Ukrainian and European leaders fairly recently, he did a complete 180, declared Ukraine could fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. Even called the Russian military a paper tiger.
Yeah, that was a huge pivot. Celebrated in Kyiv, naturally. President Zelensky called it a big shift. But how did Moscow react? Because, Trump was previously seen by them as maybe their best hope for a favorable deal.
Well, Moscow's response was kind of two-tiered, calculated for different audiences publicly. Predictable scorn, dismissal. Kremlin spokesman Peskov called Trump's victory assertion mistaken. Former President Medvedev went further, mocking Trump for having slipped into an alternate reality. You know, the usual stuff.
Right, standard public deflection. But what about behind the scenes? The private calculation.
That's where it gets interesting, because despite the public mockery, the hope seems to persist within parts of the Russian establishment. Lavrov, for instance, still talks about having some hopes for a U.S.-brokered dialogue. He keeps referring to the Trump administration potentially as a pragmatic partner, someone willing to, break from established U.S. foreign policy norms.
Which feeds right into that wedge strategy theory, doesn't it? The idea that Moscow hopes it can bypass maybe tougher European allies, go straight to the White House and hammer out some kind of bilateral U.S.-Russia deal, a grand bargain sort of negotiated over the heads of the Europeans.
Exactly. They seem to view Washington as the ultimate key, the place where a settlement closer to their maximalist aims might be achievable, even if the current rhetoric from Trump is aggressive. They're playing a longer game here, likely betting on the historical volatility of U.S. foreign policy.
But here's the paradox, and this must be making things difficult for Moscow planners. If a potential leader can flip 180 degrees on Ukraine policy practically overnight, doesn't that just reinforce the perception of the U.S. as unreliable? Why would the Kremlin offer any concessions now if U.S. policy could just swing back wildly the other way later?
That's a really profound point. That volatility might actually discourage concessions. If today's position is Ukraine wins everything back, but tomorrow's could be just give up the 4 provinces, what's the rational move for the Kremlin? Probably just to keep grinding away militarily, keep the pressure on, and wait for the next inevitable pivot in Western politics or rhetoric. They seem to be betting they can simply outlast the West's fluctuating political will.
And this strategy of waiting, of playing the long game, it seems deeply connected to their overall posture, right? Their systemic goals that go way beyond just controlling territory.
Absolutely. We have to keep emphasizing that Russia's ultimate aim looks like a systemic victory. It's about the systematic dismantling of Ukrainian statehood, ensuring it can never truly integrate with the West, that it remains permanently weakened, unstable. This war feels like an existential push for them to reverse the entire post-Cold War order in Europe.
And the evidence we're seeing suggests Russia is actually retooling its entire state for this kind of multi-year conflict, doesn't it?
Yes, the signs are there. Militarily, for instance, sources document the creation of a new strategic reserve force, starting back in the summer of 2025. This suggests plans not just for the current fight, but potentially to escalate offensive operations in Ukraine in the near to medium term. And, crucially, perhaps preparing for potential future confrontations with NATO itself down the line. This isn't just about tactical gains now, it's structural.
And maybe even more telling is the economic shift. The Russian economy seems increasingly dependent on massive state spending, almost entirely directed at military production. That must change the internal dynamics significantly.
Oh, hugely. It creates this powerful self-perpetuating cycle. You have the military-industrial complex, defense contractors, factories, entire regions economically dependent on these orders. They now have a massive vested interest in the conflict continuing. The war itself has become the main engine of state-driven economic activity, trying to pivot back to a peacetime economy suddenly. That would be incredibly destabilizing, politically and economically, for the system Putin has built. So, okay, let's pull this together. We have war aims that are fundamentally incompatible with Ukraine's existence as a sovereign nation. We have a military strategy focused on testing and degrading NATO cohesion. And we have an economic structure that's now basically hooked on perpetual conflict. What's the final takeaway, then, for you, the listener, about the prospects for peace right now? Well, the unavoidable conclusion, looking at all this, is that currently, there doesn't seem to be a viable path to a negotiated peace. Because Russia's definition of peace, which involves territorial dismemberment, political control, overturning the European security order, it's just fundamentally at odds with any notion of Ukrainian sovereignty or Western security interests. Really feels like a grim waiting game. Russia is betting its structurally reinforced commitment to war can outlast the West's political stamina and resolve.
Which leaves us with a really challenging thought for you to mull over. Given how deeply the Russian economy now seems dependent on this war footing, and considering that powerful internal lobby invested in military production, just how difficult, how politically dangerous would it actually be for the Kremlin to even try and transition back to a peacetime economy? Even if somehow the fighting were to stop tomorrow, what would that internal fallout look like? You've been listening to NationScope Podcast, where Jordan and Jamie analyze the stories shaping America and the world. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.